Thank you so much for the kind introductions, Kiran. Aparna, it's so nice to finally meet you. Welcome to Thai Boston.
Thank you for having me. I know this is like less than ideal in terms of being virtual, but really, really happy to be here.
Great. Welcome. We really missed seeing you at TiCon, but I understand, you had some very extenuating and pressing circumstances. But while this is, better late than ever, we're actually going to make it better than the in-person. So no pressure, of course, right?
Deal. It's a deal. No, thank you for being understanding and flexible. It's one of those classic, you plan for it, you're excited, you think about it for 6 months, you're getting up to almost return to your first home in Boston.
Yeah.
I had plans to meet all of our, friends and family too, and it just wasn't meant to be. Yeah.
No, I totally understand. So, Aparna, we have about 25 minutes today. That's the budget we have been given. I can probably ask you a million questions, but I have sort of whittled down this, million list in my head to about a dozen questions or so, which I think we can do justice to in the time we have. So yeah, let me just get right down to it. Actually, maybe let me just give you sort of a quick sense for what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to focus a bit on, your experiences working with some amazing people in Silicon Valley and other places. That I want to really spend the bulk of our time on understanding from you how product management, product strategy is done in tech-intensive companies. And then the last but not the least, I want to spend some time on, what sort of advice and wisdom can you share with professionals in the tech industry and other industries as well on how one can successfully navigate one's career.
Wisdom and battle scars from bad examples.
Exactly. Yeah, I want the Thai audience to learn from your mistakes, if there were any.
Exactly. So. Of course. I'm very suspect if folks say there are no mistakes, because I feel like, no attempts, no progress.
Yes, exactly. I completely agree. Okay, wonderful. So, maybe we can just start with Google. You've obviously had a long tenure at Google. You had a brilliant tenure at Google. And, I assume that companies were constantly trying to headhunt you out of Google. So, so what did Robinhood do to make you say yes?
It's a really good question. And I think the answer is a little bit less dramatic. I think for me, part of it was the timing, where I think I've been, I apologize for the ding on the computer. Part of it is the timing in terms of, I'd been at Google for more than a decade. The learning curve is something that I'd always been like looking at and saying like, what's the first derivative here? And looking at where things are maxing out. But I think two things are really striking about Robinhood and this move for me. One is there's the steel thread running through my career at Google, and even before that at Akamai, was this idea of whether it was Google Search, Assistant, YouTube, building a camera product for the next billion users in India and Indonesia. This idea of the power of democratizing access. In Google's case, in that case, it was information. But I'm really motivated by the mission of the company to democratize access to investing, because money is a fuel for life. That is one key pull. I think the second is probably a pattern match. Two founders, ex-Stanford, and with big ideas, big ambition, getting started. They inked the first chapters. I just wanted to see what the next few chapters could be written and co-written.
Oh, interesting. Can I sort of probe a bit on this notion of a steel thread? I don't think I've heard that expression before. What do you mean by the steel thread running through your career?
Yeah, what I mean by that is, some of it is post hoc, I'll admit. I think, but some of it has been looking at like, what are the common threads? If I look at, I worked in Akamai, which is an internet content delivery company. I worked at Google, and at Google really like, 3 different companies, right? As the company grows. And worked on different areas. And then I served on the board of Capital One, which again, I think there's this idea of democratizing access to credit, right? Like credit was reserved for the ones that didn't need it in some sense, right? I think this whole idea of subprime and expanding access to credit was something pioneered by Capital One, like in the 90s. So to me, I think what are the patterns and the pull that you do have when you work through it, which is a different way of looking at it versus the ladder climbing For me, I think one of the things I always thought of is like, what's the draw, right? So I think that's been one of the steel threads for sure, this idea of like expanding access. To me, the other one has been just because of my background in computer science. I think I'm naturally drawn to products and areas that have like deep technical insights, right? They're just, they bring the gun to the knife fight, so to speak.
Yep.
That's what gets my juices flowing.
Got it. Interesting. I must say, for the Thai audience, the young entrepreneurs out there, if you want to attract Aparna to your startup down the road, make sure that you're focusing on democratizing access to something big, right? That might be a good way to appeal to her. Great. That makes a lot of sense, Aparna. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the people that you probably have worked with at Google. There are people like Larry Page, Sergey Brin, Sundar Pichai, some of the most brilliant people at a world-class level have worked at Google. What is it, apart from the raw intelligence, which let's just take for granted, what interesting personality traits have you noticed?
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually think even at Akamai, I felt, Tom Layton, is one of the stalwarts of theoretical computer science. Danny Lewin, who unfortunately passed away at 9/11, but was the CTO. And then, Google, the same thing, right? And actually, like there are many more folks who are absolute, like, stars. And now I see that in the founders with Robinhood too. I think you're right. One is certainly this, just like off the charts IQ, if you will, right? But I think two other things really strike me as something that just like really stretches my mind. One is this, at the risk of sounding cliched, the ability to think ridiculously big, right? Almost like to the level of absurdity, but somehow put it. So I'll give you an example, right? We were in some review meeting with, I think, Larry, and we came up with options of like A, B, and C. And then he asked about D, which is like 100x the capacity of what we can do, right? And the reality is that, okay, that was just like, the first reaction you have as a product building team is like, that makes no sense. But then you go back here. So the immediate feeling of like interacting with that kind of like, kind of mindset is disappointing, right? Because you feel like, oh shit, like this is not going anywhere. I put in all this work. But an hour after, a day after, you realize that just forces you to think, what is the core essence of what you're trying to do? And what's that one dimension where you have to really amp up? And I think the thinking behind it is also appealing, which is there's a fixed cost to doing things. Right. And I think it's actually easier. And this is something like Larry had said publicly too, that it's actually easier to take on really ambitious things because no one's actually trying to attempt them precisely because they're so big. But I think they have a fixed cost too. I think that's one thing. This idea of like thinking, stretching the dimensions to like, order of magnitude bigger, faster, stronger, whatever dimension. And I think the second one is, and this I think is like, surrounding themselves with people who are not just who can have that healthy debate, because that's the flip side to it, right? If you there are certain cases where that 100x prompt is a great one, but you can't take all of that literally, right? And not in all ways. The minds work in very interesting dimensions, but you can't take all of that literally. So having folks who can execute and build and operate and know the law of physics that govern things is great.
That's really interesting. I remember, reading this quote by this guy, John Seeley Brown, who was chief scientist of Xerox, where he says something like, if I ask you to build a copier, which is, which makes 50% less noise, that's not a hard problem. Yeah. But if I ask you to make a copier that's noiseless, now you have to invent new technology to make that happen.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that makes
that's spot on. I think it's, in fact, I think that's repeatedly what I've seen, which is there is the ambition of it. There is intelligence, there's ambition, but there's also the forcing you to kind of get off the current hill that you're climbing, and forces you to go after bigger hills that either lead to technical breakthroughs or looking at a completely different and much bigger market, or building different products or solving different problems.
Got it. I see you used a metaphor that's close to my heart. I'm an optimization PhD, and so right. So you don't want to settle for a local optima, right? You want to try to get a global optimal solution. So let me ask you sort of a slightly like an opposing question to this point of view, which I certainly subscribe to. How does this jive with this whole notion of, do a minimum viable product, do incremental improvements, and keep iterating your way to product market fit, right? Like, how do you balance this incremental improvement versus sort of doing the dramatic new direction?
Yeah. I think about this a lot, because exactly, I think if you take these, if you juxtapose these two ideas, this seems directly in opposition. To me, I think the one nuance I think about is the stage of the product. So for example, and the nature of the 10x. So for example, I think when there is like a well-established problem, right? I think take actually search, right? Google search. Now there'd been Alta Vista. For those of you who are younger, there were other search engines. Said Google was probably
remember Excite.
Excite, exactly. Yeah, we're dating ourselves, but those were in the 90s. There were many search engines, and they worked, right? I mean, there was another one which started with L. I'm blanking out, but yeah, there's a Lycos. That's right. You're right, Rama. I think the thing is, in that case, the parameters of the problem was defined, but I think the engine could be 20x or 100x different, right? Like in terms of like crawling the entire web, being extremely fast, extremely effective, higher precision recall, and so on. So in those cases, I think it absolutely makes sense to say, like, you're coming in late to the party, like, so bring something really, really meaningful here. But I think there are other problem areas where I think it makes, if you're trying to define a new category of products, the onus is on you to make sure that you're the MVP, and you're kind of you're working on the MVP, and like you're looking first for the product market fit before you say, okay, let's scale and like have growth and so on. So I think that's the nature of the problem, or the stage of the evolution of the category. I do think the second thing is, look, in my mind, if you look at the chart of a timeline of a company and like the product development, right? There'll be a whole bunch of things that are games of inches. And then there's a few that are what I think of as games of miles, right? Those are the moments you do absolutely want to apply. Like, if you're building a phone today, right? You better bring something extremely differentiated and valuable that is meaningfully, like, you tell me that I don't have to charge the phone for 5 days. Okay, now I'm listening, right? But if you say, like your messages are slightly more, well formulated, not going to make a difference, right? So I think like there are a few games of miles in the timeline of a company, but a lot of it is the game of inches. And I think that's where MVP and the grind and like making sure you're like diagnosing the metrics and like learning and growing make a ton of difference.
Got it. No, that makes a lot of sense. So if I were to sort of just synthesize for my own understanding, let me know if I got it right. So what you're saying is that when you're conceiving of a product or a platform, you want to think really ambitiously, because to use your metaphor, you want to be climbing like the biggest hill. You don't want to be settling for a smaller hill. But once the direction is established and you're building something for that long vector, if you will, you may still have to do like a grinding MVP as you journey up that mountain, right? Knowing fully well at some points there is this punctuated equilibrium, but you have to do jumps, right, to distance yourself from the competition. Is that a fair?
That is, the much better put than I did, which is I think this idea of like you kind of like aim big but act small, right?
Yeah, got it. So actually that actually is a great segue to maybe like the big thing I wanted to ask you about. So you've been at the helm of some really cutting edge products, right, over the last decade, very tech intensive products. I think I speak for the entire Thai community when I say that we would love to get a distillation of the things you have learned, right, in product management, product strategy, product leadership. So let's start with, what are the top 3 things product people must get right?
Rama, do you have a few hours? So there are a lot of battle scars and a few wins that probably I can derive from. One, first of all, I think maybe I'll start with the things that I've seen up close, just like working on, as you said, tech-intensive products, but consumer products. One is, I think, this notion that I talk about, which is like solve before scale. And I guess now the folks call it like product market fit before growth, in one sense, right? Because I think a lot of times there's this urge to kind of say, oh, I got this right. Like people kind of like it. So early data shows that folks are, there's some retention I'm seeing, there's some engagement I'm seeing for the product. Let's go like pour gas on this. Let's figure out how to get more users or different markets. And it applies to enterprise and consumer. And I think one of the challenges with that is like, you really want to you want to convince yourself and get hard conviction that you've actually truly solved the problem in a materially different way. Because what happens when you start like scaling prematurely is that you run up against switching costs. Most people don't, if you just, again, like user research is the other dangerous tool here. Like you get feedback and sometimes you hear what you want to hear, and folks will say, yeah, this is good. But that is the stated versus revealed preferences. So I think this solve before scale is really important, and defining and having a really high bar for what solving means. Because once you get that click, so the sound of click, then the scaling becomes much easier problem. Actually, there are existing playbooks for scaling on consumer side or on the enterprise side. The solving is the hard part, right? Anyway, so that's one.
Can I interrupt you?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, solve before scale. I love that. It reminds me of something that I think Mark Andreessen said, where he said, someone asked him, how do you know you've achieved product market fit? And his response was, well, the market will reach into your startup and pull the product out, right? That metaphor was always very sort of vivid in my head. So I'm curious, I think everyone intellectually will sort of understand solve before scale, but when you're in the trenches, right, you have happy ears, you want to hear what you want to hear. How do you make sure that you actually get it right? Like what exactly would you do on a Monday morning to make sure you got it right?
Yeah, and I think this is one where I've found the value of, and actually that's one of the things I really appreciate about like how the team works even in Robinhood, where primary research is your friend. I think you will, and you have to actually interpret the research in a really honest and truth-seeking way. That's the one thing I would say. Like Monday morning, you get feedback from customers. So there's two tools, right? There's qualitative and quantitative. And early days, the problem is you don't get too much of quantitative data, right? And like this subject to a lot of interpretation. You should look at it. Like obviously, if folks are just like bouncing back, and there's a lot of like lukewarm use in terms of like 30-day active retention, and these are some like on the consumer side, but equivalent on enterprise. You get some signal. You get actually the negative signal, meaning that if the product, when you have not gotten it, right? I think the primary research or qualitative feedback is the one where if there are folks literally jumping up and down about the problem, about the product that you have, and the feedback that you're getting is overwhelmingly positive, I think then that's a good sign that you can proceed further, right? The other thing that I've seen is this is more of a kind of like working this out on paper. Again, you'll have the data from the market. That's the biggest sign. But the additional like probably supporting sign here is, are you all using the product, right? And are you kind of sometimes I think like it's a very clear thing that folks inside the company like don't use the product, or like find easy things that are like hard things about the problem, then you haven't gotten it right. You can't. It's almost like, is there an irresistible pull for the product, right? Now that sounds a little bit hand wavy and like kind of touchy feely, but that's because I think it is, in the sense that in the early days you got to be really like close to the product and know it at that Zoom level to know what's working, what's not. And this is the other thing I wanted to say, which is, at least personally, I've found that sometimes I've been working you work on the product and you're kind of like completely lost in the weeds. So sometimes there are certain products where I systematically would go and talk to the most skeptical people, right? and like actually have them try the product and just see them use that product and make notes. There's no substitute for that. And that's your job as a product builder. That's totally your job. If you're not doing it, then nobody cares, right? And I think sorry, this topic is so clear to me that I'm going on and on about this.
No, this is like really, really insightful and valuable stuff. So please continue.
And there is no substitute for just like, marinating in the product. But this whole like zoom levels, how do you kind of manage the zoom levels is something there's a meta thread that needs to run in the product builder's case, where you're like really close to it because the devil and the god is in the details. And sometimes you're 1 or 2 turns away from a product market fit. And so there's this question of like, kind of, that's why the micro matters. That is like really maniacally analyzing, okay, like exactly what screen, almost down to what screen are people actually not following, or they're bouncing off, right? And what part of it is like really not differentiated. And where is the 10x, right? Where is that 10x differentiation? If you look at your like entire like workflow, or if you look at your, so I think there is a lot of micro involved here. So I think that's the other thing. It's not an intellectual exercise. It's not just an intellectual exercise where you've solved on paper and said, oh, there's a big market, I have the product, people are using it. I ask them and they politely say, yeah, I would use it, right? You have to look for signs that it's being used qualitatively and quantitatively, but really turn on the zoom level and go micro is my experience.
No, that makes a lot of sense to me. And, sort of solve before scale, right? Sort of the overall tenet, if you will. And then within that, be prepared to operate on multiple zoom levels. Make sure the macro picture is right, but zoom into the micro to make sure the macro is not misleading you. And I also like this very sort of Popperian falsification thing where you go after the people who are skeptics and try to figure out, okay, why do you hate my product? Why do you not use my product, and so on. So, and there is no substitute for doing all of these things. Right? And you're hoping that when you step back, all of these things are pointing in a consistent direction.
Yeah. And the reality is, again, like there's a big, trumping factor in all of this. Sometimes it's timing, right? So the why now, I think solve before scale is a good prompt. But I think the second thing that product builders, I think, have to think about when they're starting out is most of the problems are defined, right? I think the solutions aren't, but people have, if there's a meaningful problem, consumers have figured out a way to work around it, right? There isn't a few exceptions to it where there's just massive technology breakthroughs, then, that things that weren't possible before are possible now, and so on. But I think in a lot of cases, people have found their desired paths and like workarounds, and the user jobs are getting done, right? It's just that in some cases, it's really unsatisfactory for customers. So what you're coming in and saying, hey, you've identified this problem, or you've defined it in a certain way that's really unique and big, and you're coming up with your solutions, right? So the onus is on the product builders to say, why now, right? Why is something, of course, people, spend a lot of time, entrepreneurs spend a lot of time thinking about it. But I think that the why now matters. So I'll give you an example. This is where I failed. I started out, at Google many years ago, and I was really excited about this idea of being able to use visual search, right? And a lot of times I felt like it's a huge market where you're not able to, textual search can only go so far. And being able to point to something and say, show me a flower vase like that, or, translate this entire sign for me, and so on. So assembled a team, worked on it, and turned out at that time, the precision recall and core computer vision just wasn't there, right? So the wow to what the hell ratio was really low, right? Like once in a while, the product would amaze you because it identified that exact bird or whatever. But I think most of the time you had to you had to try it a few times, it didn't work, so you went back to the textual search, which was a disappointing experience, right? Fast forward, I don't know, 10 years, thanks to mobile phones and the scale, camera and sensors, there's a hardware a kind of revolution there, and like the parts are much cheaper. So cameras on the phone are ridiculously powerful. That's one. I think the second is, just thanks to data and computation, all of the algorithms, right, work that much better. There's, it's the same algorithms with neural networks and computer vision, but now it's like reached human accuracy. So that wow to WTF ratio completely changes. And then I think the third is people's behavior, right? They have phones, everybody has phones, everybody's phones have cameras, and they're taking pictures all the time. But suddenly they have a lot of pictures where they do want this data, right? They have taken pictures of, their friend's bag or whatever, right? And so I think that the why now, and we built pretty much the same product, and it just like worked, right?
That's really interesting.
With less heartache.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that the why now is obviously always important.
Yeah.
But if something doesn't work now, it could be because you're just too early for a variety of reasons. And it doesn't mean it's a bad idea. You may have to revisit it later because the underlying forces may be coming into alignment in a better way for you, right?
Right. And and to acknowledge the hard thing here, it's not always possible to like align the timing. Sometimes you think it's around the corner. In fact, actually, for many years, folks said, oh yeah, vision's almost solved, speech recognition is almost solved. It wasn't. So it's hard as an entrepreneur to get that guess. But that's why I think the whole early parts and early feedback matters a lot, because if, for example, you get the feedback that it's like, that it's technically unreliable, and there are some foundational elements that haven't happened, breakthroughs that haven't happened, the problem is well beyond you. Unless you're like, you have a lot of cash and a lot of capital to deploy towards solving that technical breakthrough. And this is where big companies do have an advantage, right?
Right. So, so solve before scale is an important tenet. And this whole idea of why now is another important tenet. What else? I asked for 3 things, and I know you have a million, but give me.
I think the third one that's really sounds simplistic, but I think I've consistently found asking the question and like useful is meeting users where they are. And I mean it in multiple levels. One is, I think, literally like actually thinking about solving problems where you're trying to accelerate existing customer behavior versus expecting them to switch and dramatically. Just imagine they've been out, they don't give. So as a product builder, you need to know, like, you have to have a thick skin. They don't give a shit about your product. Like, they have, life existed before it, life exists after it. The customer's life is going on. They have these user jobs to be done. They're working around, they're kind of figuring stuff out. So they have their like grooves cut, right? And so in some sense, it's much easier. Not that switching cannot be done. It's much easier for you to observe and say, how can you accelerate the existing behavior, compress that, like those 10 steps to 1 step, versus and say, I know you've been doing this thing. Can you try this other completely different, like this, path, right? So that's one interpretation, meeting users where they are. I think there's another element here, which is a lot of times product builders, myself included, think about the product journey from like the screen. Let's say you're building a mobile experience from the screen that they open your app. That's not where the journey starts. And the journey starts where it's in your pocket for a customer. And there are a million things from that to even like opening your app or going to your website. And so really thinking about that step, oftentimes there's a lot of effort put into once you're on the screen, like how do you make sure that you use this feature and the other feature and we'll add features and so on. But like the hard part, and then actually people do now think about new user experience and onboarding and all of that, but all of that presupposes that they've done this already and like they've gone through everything, search for your app, like have that. That step is the hardest step, right? So figuring out why in their cubby holes, like, where you are in their mental cubby holes, and why would they pull the phone out and like use your product, and what is that prompt, is also another way of thinking about meeting users where they are, right?
Got it. Interesting. No, that's really insightful and valuable. Gosh, I could double click on any of these things and chat with you for hours, Aparna, but I'm also mindful of the time. So I want to ask you one last product question, then I want to switch and talk about some career related questions. I guess my last product question is, when you're recruiting product people, what do you look for? Is there like a magic ingredient?
Yeah, actually, I have a strong point of view on that, there isn't. I think because I think that a lot of these skills are learnable, and a lot of these skills are kind of like, um, learned through experience. I think, of course, depends on junior versus senior product folks. I'd say two characteristics. One is, I think this, you know, uh, giving a damn about the product experience and the customers. I think that I have seen to be a lot more of like binary, meaning there are folks who just like intuitively think about and instinctively think about, well, why is this working this way, and how they're the ones who are sitting in the Uber and asking the Uber driver about like the app that they're using and so on, right? So I think that innate curiosity about how people get their work done, how people like, what do people like about, like, say, this music app versus that I do look for, that innate curiosity. It's hard to actually look for it in a short interview time frame. So that's why I think, like, I'm a big fan of just product jam sessions to actually figure out like how people think. The other one is this idea of in product builders, I think you typically, there are three spikes. One is, I think, you're really spike on storytelling or the vision. The other is this maniacal execution. You just know all the pieces that need to go into actually shipping something. And third is like influencing and bringing along leadership, right? Bringing along everybody. Because as a product builder, I think there's a trope that, oh, as a PM or a product leader, you're the CEO of the product. I think that's BS. I think like no one's the CEO of product. I think it's just you're all in service of the customer, but you do kind of have to orchestrate, and you do have to make hard calls and bring people along. Typically, I find that people spike in like one or two of these three. So I think the unit I think about is the team and that product as the atomic unit, and say, is this particular jigsaw piece of a product builder the right PM, the right shape for this particular problem and the team, right?
Got it.
So the same person can be a great fit for a different problem.
Right. It strikes me, this whole notion of, do they actually care about, do they have this sort of innate curiosity about how these apps and products work? They can't even help themselves, right? They have to get into it, right? And so I wonder if you can, when they're waiting in the interview room or something, you have a little app sort of accidentally lying around and see if you pick it up or something. Anyway.
Oh, I love that.
I love a bit devious, but
have props in there.
Yeah, exactly.
The virtual world, it's a little bit hard, but maybe like you just have a screen there that just shows different apps. I love it.
Cool. All right, great, wonderful. That was wonderful, Aparna. I think great advice and insights. So I have just two last questions, and again, I think we are almost out of time. So in your career so far, what have you learned that you want, like, younger people or older people for that matter, to keep in mind, things that you wish you knew back in the day when you graduated from school?
Oh boy, do you have 5 hours, Rama? the mistakes of books could be. No, I think look, maybe one thing I do regret. I wish I'd known that taking risks and the right kind of risks is actually not just okay, but more than okay. It's actually highly worth it from multiple dimensions, and kind of like it builds muscle groups. It's actually like, it's the way that you grow, especially in an industry like tech, where almost every few years there's a shift in, and again, like some of the ideas are the same, all the way from 1960s. It's like server to client. It's the same bundling to unbundling. It's, if you zoom out at the high level, the ideas are the same, but I think when you at the appropriate zoom level, there's so many different, there's always like so much new and exciting and innovative happening. So I think taking more risks, I really wish I had done that earlier on in my career. I think the second thing I would say is this again sounds a little bit controversial. I think people talk about being political or being, oh, I don't like politics. Oh man, like I really want to do the work and like I don't like politics. And I think there's truth to it. There are kind of like really Machiavellian people everywhere. Like it's the nature of humanity. But I think people. For me, I think as a technologist, I mean, I grew up studying computer science. I dropped out of a PhD in computer science. So for me, there was this chip on the shoulder that, oh, I'm the objective, like I just care about the hard stuff, right? And I think over time, I've made the shift to say, it's human nature. Working well with other people and bringing them along and listening to them and actually building great, strong relationships is a huge advantage from the business perspective, but also makes actually a lot of the work meaningful, right? Because ultimately you're building for other people. And if you can't work with other people to make things, I think your impact on the world is limited, right? By definition, it's linear versus network. So I think even if you want to think about it in the nerdy way that would have appealed to me, is like, hey, you're like, it's order n square versus n. So like, you better figure out how to, get the impact. If you want the broader impact, you do need to figure out how to work really well and build great relationships, great teams, great organizations, recruit talent. All of that becomes really important.
Right, right. I mean, I guess the hard stuff is necessary but not sufficient. So is the soft stuff, but hopefully together they're both necessary and sufficient, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think this may be just me, but I think like especially a lot of us starting out in tech have the kind of natural appreciation for the hard stuff, right? Because it's more measurable, it's more objective. It's just also there's like bad, role models on the soft stuff sometimes. Sometimes we all know the folks who've just like, kissed ass and like figured out stuff. They don't get shit done. And like somehow they just rise up and you think like, I don't want to be that bozo, right? But there are really also very, very meaningful alternate role models where you bring people along and like truly hold hands and like work on things, right? That doesn't mean you don't have hard debates, but I think you have to be able to figure out how to work with others and have things done versus doing things alone.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Aparna, would you like to add anything extra for women professionals in particular?
I think, yeah, actually this is one where the risk taking, I do feel like is, at the risk of generalizing, I do find that the playing it safe is something that's a little bit more common, and partly very rational probably, because I do think there is within companies, I think there's a lot more of bet on men on potential and women on performance. So it's a very rational thing to say that. I joke now that I'm in fintech, I am using all these like finance metaphors and say, okay, like we bet on men like they're high alpha stocks and like women as if they're index funds, right? Like they're super safe choices. Once they've like really done the job, they're like, yeah, I think you can do the job, right? So it's very rational that women play it safe, because I think that's what gets rewarded. I really think we have to change the way we look at it and actually pick a few of these cases where even if that woman leader took the risk and it didn't work out, you basically like make it a point to kind of reward that behavior, because that one role model will help a lot of people.
Right. No, that makes a lot. But I do like the notion of index funds versus alpha. I never thought of it in the context of gender roles in the workplace. That's very cool. Great. Well, final question, Aparna. What is next for you? Is a CEO role in the offing? Not to get you into trouble with with Vlad Tenev or anything, but I'm just curious.
No, right now I actually feel like I'm not, this sounds so cliched, and I've heard people say that and I roll my eyes, but I'm going to say it, which is I really am not the what's next person. In fact, I think almost to a fault, I hyper focus on the current area and current situation. And right now, I do think that the opportunity is huge. We just have an entire new next generation of people for whom I think finance is intersecting with culture, right? And finance was this like remote, cold, ivory tower, Gates, Wall Street thing. And now I think it's a massive opportunity as somebody who doesn't like spend their weekends obsessing over like kind of like, stocks or funds or like APRs and so on. I think it's because for a broad set of people, finance is intimidating. So I think there's a big opportunity to actually say, make it welcoming, make it inviting to a lot more people, and make it work for them, right? Imagine if like you could build credit cards, you could build a whole bunch of like products that just help you save versus have predatory practices that, like just put you in a hole. You could save and invest for future while you spend. But that's where my head's at. Like there's so much to be done here.
Got it. Well, I think I can safely speak for the Thai community when I say that we'll all be we'll continue to watch your meteoric career with great interest. So Aparna, thank you so much for spending all this time with us. I learned a great deal from this conversation. I have no doubt that the folks who are going to see it are going to learn a ton as well. These are really valuable insights. And I hope we get a chance to meet in person one of these days.
Yeah, absolutely. I really would love to see. And, this is, as I said, Boston's first home, the winters notwithstanding. So I do think that I would love to be back in person and hopefully, be part of the Thai community in some form or the other there. I really appreciate folks listening and, participating in this too.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you so much, Aparna. And I wish you all the best for your career and life and beyond.
Thank you so much, Rama. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.